Welcome, sit down, put your feet up on a Gorean slave if you have one. Today I am reviewing John Norman's 11th novel of the Gorean Cycle, sometimes called the Counter-Earth Chronicles and occasionally both, but this particular volume is Slave Girl of Gor. Now that title alone should tell you that this review comes with a content warning, so if you are under the age of 18, now's the time to leave. Perhaps check out one of my other videos on your way out, but definitely head on out. Now, long-time subscribers of this channel may well remember my review of the first novel in the series, Talsman of Gor, and I read that one motivated by Michael Moorcock's campaign to cancel the Gorean novels, and I wondered what all the fuss was about, and the first novel didn't really provide any definitive answers, whereas this one does. I will say up front that I have not read the intervening 10 books in the series, so I may well make errors in the series lore, and this being the internet, I'm sure that nobody needs any encouragement to offer corrections on that count. But the story here doesn't really carry much over from the previous novels. The protagonist of the first book, Tal Cabot, is mentioned on the back cover, but not in the text. Instead, the story begins with an Earth girl called Judy Thornton, transported unwittingly from an elite Earth college. She wakes up naked and chained to a rock on Gor. Along come two warriors speaking a foreign language and making demands she doesn't understand. The inability to communicate leads those two to decide to cut her throat, a situation she is rescued from by another passing warrior who makes short work of his peers. He takes Judy to his camp, a small military establishment in the bracket near a cave. Here she is branded a slave and made to skivvy and serve for the men of the camp in a fairly humiliating fashion. The military camp's there for the men to reconnoitre the surroundings in time to raid a passing caravan. In the caravan is the lady Sabina, due to marry son of a lord and cement a political alliance. But they raid the camp, they steal the lady, and then they brand her into slavery too. Judy's owner, who takes an age to be named as anything other than that or master in Judy's first-person narrative, is actually called Clitus Vitellius. Vitellius being nobody's favourite Roman emperor, least of all the astronomers, but what's in a name? Vitellius clearly starts to have feelings for Judy, now herself given the slave name of Dina, and he gives her away to some peasants in exchange for hunting beasts, largely because having feelings makes him a bit of a sissy, and men on Gor are real men. Life among the peasants involves tending crops, beasts, and a steady diet of casual rape. It's a life that Earth girls, and particularly Judy, are not really cut out for, and the town leader, after defending himself against a usurper, gives her away to a trader. The trader in turn sells her on to be the serving wench and moist hole at a pagabar. From there she's taken to yet another owner, this one a female who disapproves of anyone with anything swinging between their thighs. Here we have the first semblance of a fantasy plot begin to bubble to the surface, not bad for page 300 of a 440-page novel. Her mistress says she is to be the carrier of a secret message and taken across the sea and air. The voyage is pretty foul, as such things must be, with Judy/Dina locked in the hold and contending with the shipboard carnivorous rodents. Making landfall, she's taken to a town and she works there for some time before it is raided, and she is taken to another town and works there in another pagabar. There she bumps into our friend Clitus Vitellius in town on a spying mission, and she betrays him to her owner. He is captured and she is taken in secret to a mysterious stranger where she beads a necklace in order to deliver a secret message. From there she is returned to her mistress in Ar, but the convoy is raided on the way and the ship sunk, stranding her for a time on the wreckage with none other than Vitellius, who had arranged the raid as much to get his revenge as anything else. Vitellius is working with Bosk of Tar, and they work out that Judy has delivered a coded message to their enemies. They then return her to her mistress, and she works there for a while before Bosk arrives to capture the wannabe spy and enslave her too. Judy is once again sold at the market, delivered there by Vitellius as part of his revenge. He then buys her back at a ridiculous overpay while asserting his manly dominance in a way that would make both Gerard Butler and Christian Grey cringe. He takes Judy as his slaves, foregoing other slaves because apparently she's a slut and that's good enough for him. Try to stay your fingers over that dislike button though, because those are his words and not mine. And if you thought that those words were slightly inflammatory, her words are that to truly be a woman, she must be a slave to a man. The sound you just heard was the spontaneous combustion of feminists around the world. The opening of this book, with Julie indelicately treated, chained to a rock, naked in foreign lands, and unable to communicate, actually had the makings of something rather good. It might almost have appeared in the magazines of Joseph Campbell some years earlier. The concept is interesting, perhaps the stuff of nightmares, but it half promises a situation that a plucky heroine will need an abundance of wits and skills to resolve, but Norman doesn't write that sort of book. There's very little sense that Judy will save herself, and not much that any potential rescuer would do so for any reasons other than their own interests, basically. Yet, if you're a mind to try a series where everybody dabbles in a little grey morality, this is one of those where things are remarkably bleaker. It's a shame, really, because a novella on this premise with a heroine worthy of the title, and that's the title heroine, not the title of this novel, that novella could be really quite interesting, and a heroine able to resolve that situation through learning and guile is a heroine that the world could use right now. Who knows, if the author had given her some clothes to wear, it might even have attracted a less niche audience. Instead, this novel is long, with a capital long, as the prior plot summary probably demonstrated. Entirely narrated in the first person, this is also episodic and repetitive in the extreme, and ultimately 2/3 of the novel would be better issued entirely. The repetition is almost more interesting than the story. Judy repeatedly telling herself, "I am Judy Thornton, a top student in an elite college, an English major and poetess." This becomes a sort of mantra and gives way slowly to the acceptance of her position as a slave and the new name that she's given. But it isn't an especially smooth transition for the literature or for the characters, with Judy flogged for begging to be freed long after she had supposedly accepted it as an impossibility. Additionally, the repetition continues through so many scenes and other characters' dialogue that it becomes much more of a motif of the book and its author than Judy's psyche, ultimately making it a struggle to be convincing as a character study, particularly to anyone outside of a relationship based on bondage and sadomasochism. Initially, Judy's treatment by the men of Gor surprises her, but it isn't long before it also begins to sexually arouse her. Her worship of the physically brutal Gorean males is contrasted against the weak and subservient men of Earth. The depiction of our world as having lost its way from true biology seems like Norman's attempt at a Heinlein-style direction of mankind, not the novel's only debt to Heinlein. And like his lofty peer, Norman too will likely fail to convince the masses that a traditional marriage is not the way forward. If he really wanted to influence the direction of mankind, the author probably should have written a novel less likely to offend the school board, and the regular depictions of women as only capable of finding their place under a male boot heel will probably only find favour with the librarians that are fictional characters themselves in porn films. But appearing in a fantasy novel published in 1980, even when writing about the regular rapes and sex slavery of his story, Norman has to mince his words and avoid the explicit. It might be to his credit that it does, because the novel avoids the deepest level of 50 Shades cringe. But one of the novel's, I guess, set pieces is when Judy is masturbated with a whip in front of a crowd of slave buyers in order to prove that she is a hot slut. Not my words, those are Norman's own. And ample proving of that fact drives up her price, but not being able to say that's what is happening means that Norman has to describe it like this. "Suddenly I screamed, fighting the looped, heavy coil of the whip." And the fact that I can read that aloud on YouTube without fearing the heavy hand of the censor shows that it isn't clear at all what's happening. I assumed at this point that she was actually being whipped, but the rest of the scene clears things up amply. And if you're of the mind that Norman would write like that deliberately to suggest that Judy's sexuality was like some kind of punishment to her, then I think you're only kidding yourself. She might flip-flop over her slavery, but she is, in Norman's word, a hot slut with some consistency. It really is only a question of whether her acceptance of slavery, her musings on why that is a fitting state for women, or her sexual satisfaction at the hands and other appendages of various abusers, which one of those will offend readers more. That is, unless they're into that sort of sexual relationship, one I expect, if the novel were rather more explicit, might well have appealed to and found some of that 50 Shades audience. This certainly has vibes of E.L. James, both in its sexual themes and its repetitive nature. However, it's also somewhat reminiscent of Heinlein's Citizen of the Galaxy. The hero of that novel, Thorby, also starts the story in slavery, though not of the sexual kind. He moves through 4 or 5 cultures, and each mini-adventure in them is really a chance for an ethnographic study of that culture in order to consider the finer points of what freedom really means. This novel is similar. Judy experiences Vitellius's military camp, peasant life, and works in the Pagaba and then for her wealthy mistress. And each of those, in turn, is an opportunity for Norman to explore the lore of his world, which is rich and detailed and will likely please those reading this for the fantasy element rather more than the sexual deviance will. Norman, though, continues to use the same encyclopedic tone as he did back in Book 1, which seems here, more than anywhere, an unnecessary amount of effort, given that the series has ceased to be a fantasy now and moved fully into being a BDSM fantasy. Surely nobody bought this book for its growth of the series lore like this that includes the classic line, "It is of interest," but doesn't provide a serious guesser who would actually be interested in this after such a deluge of rape and abuse. Focusing on the politics of bondage and the lore of the series leaves Norman rather skirting over the action, which is rare, and if I'm generous, where it appears at all, is rather lackluster, as in this example. Suddenly, as though by common accord, each crying out, each uttering a savage cry, they hurled themselves at one another. It was the ritual of spear casting. The spear of him who was one of my captors seemed to leap upward and away, caroming off the oblique lifted surface of the stranger's shield. The spear, caroming from the shield, flew more than 100 feet away, dropping to the grass where it stood, remote and useless, the butt of its shaft pointing to the sky. The stranger's spear had penetrated the shield of he who was one of my captors, and the stranger, bracing the shaft between his arm and body, had lifted his opponent's shield and turned, throwing it and his opponent, who had not the time to slip from the shield straps, to the ground at his feet. The stranger's blade, now loosed from its sheath, under the opponent's helmet, lay at his throat. Now this first half demonstrates capably the repetitive style that Norman utilises. His failure to have named either of his characters at this point leaves him with this awkward trading of opponent and stranger. And there really isn't an excuse for the double caroming, and even less so for the repeated "he who was one of my captors." Unwieldy phrasing anywhere, but particularly here when we're trying to generate pace and excitement by fragmenting our sentences, which is something which is particularly evident in the second half of the scene, which sadly also loses something by its over-reliance on duplication. One man wheeled back, grunting, turning, and fell to his knee in the grass, and then, turning to his side, lying upon his shoulder, doubled, hunched in pain, bleeding, his hands at his belly, his blade lost in the grass. 3/4 of the way through the novel, Norman begins his plot, and oddly, this is the part of the novel that makes the least sense because it unpicks that lengthy plot description that I just did. It transpires that Judy is to be deliverer of a top-secret encoded message, a message that the enemies have gone to great lengths to deliver. They have, after all, travelled to Earth from Gor to kidnap Judy and then bring her back with them. At some undefined, also unexplained point, Judy was left chained to a rock in the middle of nowhere. However, the bad guys must have had some idea of where she was because they found her before any harm was done. However, they mistook the task that they were given and demanded worthless slave beads from her, even though she was naked. This book, being the book it is, of course, that doesn't preclude the possibility that she might have them somewhere on, perhaps in her person. Regardless, she can't communicate with them and they can't with her, so they decide to kill her. And if they hadn't been interrupted by Vitellius's arrival, the bad guys would have kidnapped an Earth girl, somehow lost her while she was chained to a rock, and then arrived knowing they couldn't communicate with her, and then killed her because they couldn't communicate with her. Oh, and before I forget, prior to that, they also hypnotized her to know, without her knowing, a secret message. A fair amount of effort to let go to waste so sloppily. Vitellius takes her and after a few weeks in camp, uses her as a decoy in a dangerous military mission. She survives as much by luck as anything else, given that we are repeatedly told that slave girls are worthless, untrained Earth girls even less so. Judy's value is a mere 3 copper tasks at this point in the book, but she survives and is then rescued by Vitellius, who sometime later gives her away to peasant villagers. She resides with them for a while, is then given to a trader who sells her to a tavern where she's used and abused for a while again, before eventually being kidnapped by the same 2 men who are going to kill her while she was chained to a rock. She then serves their mistress for a while before being sent by air and sea to a different land to deliver the message. Now the sea journey also takes a while and is fraught with danger, not least being chained in cages with extremely limited mobility, but accessible to rats. Norman doesn't mention the dangers of infected rat bites, but he does mention the risk of being thrown over the side by irritable crew members. Quite a risk then to a message one has gone to such pains to deliver. And thank God it's not urgent, because in the foreign land she works in another bar before eventually being stolen away one night to deliver the message. So not urgent, but clearly not important either, because if it was, surely they would then murder the slave girl from Earth that nobody's going to miss. Eventually Judy is found by the bad guys, or the good guys, or the other side certainly, and they crack the hypnotism and decode the message. It reads, "Half-ear arrives." One assumes he arrives and arrived many, many months before the message ever got delivered. An absolute ridiculous waste of time, even were I not to single out for special contempt the captured soldier who says he will talk on the 19th hour, and makes such a point of labouring this, it would be very clear to even a 4-year-old that he ought to up his guard somewhere before the 19th hour rolls around. Overall, fans of this series will know better than I how much of a departure this is from the norm for the series at this point, but it's quite a startling jump from book 1 to 11. There is little here that actually requires a total knowledge of the series to follow and understand. I think it can be largely read as a standalone novel. It isn't difficult to follow in that regard. I would urge strong caution to people thinking of starting the series here, though, due to the content. Neither the violence or the sex is particularly graphic because of the era it was published in, and because it was published at all. The sexual slavery and associated violence, though, is a big part of the story, and the depictions of it, and Judy's acceptance of it, and musings on those Earth men and women who would reject it, are likely to provoke some strong reactions. The tacked-on fantasy plot in the last quarter of the novel is not very interesting, and it doesn't seem very likely or worthwhile, nor does it offer any real advancement to the wider story of the series. I do not recommend this book to anyone unless they're a feminist looking to provoke their own ire, or somebody who's absolutely devoted to the series. I have no interest at all in what people do in their own bedrooms, and less so about what they do in their dungeons, and I see this rather more as Norman airing his BDSM fantasy to the world than making any sensible commentary on his times. I'm likely wrong, but it's slightly more palatable that way. The first book wasn't bad, offering a decent enough tale and a Barosian Campbellian romp. While explicit for its time, it's not really for ours, and this book instead is just a predictable and mediocre erotic fantasy, and a slightly less than mediocre fantasy. Slave Girl of Gor is highly likely to offend a lot of people, and may well bore even more. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you ring the bell, I will see you in the next one. Bye.